Dwight, as always, and Susan for helping to arrange a visit, and I deeply appreciate your hospitality. I look forward to these 2 weeks of study together. I have to say I remembered to bring everything except my devices this morning. So I'll do the best I can, but I am eager to learn with you. What I have to offer this morning, it comes from a course that I taught this past fall at Hamlin University, entitled, What Can a Table Tell Us About Jesus' World? Today I'd like to tell you about the structure of the course, and next week spend most of our time together doing a portion of it together. The course begins with this premise. As a movement of intimates becomes a tradition, sensibilities that are best attuned to the founder's world are going to be reshaped by circumstances faced by subsequent adherents. The tradition, if it's going to sustain itself, has to abstract an extendable salient from those original lived contexts, those lived realities of the founders. You mine those beginnings for transmittable meaning, and those circumstances then tend to die with the people who actually lived. With that in mind, in the fall of 2017, I offered a semester-long first-year seminar at Hamlin. We had 19 students in the seminar. As I said, the title was, What Can a Table Tell Us About Jesus' World? The purpose of first-year seminars is to provide new students with an introduction to academic life at Hamlin, rooted in one of the academic programs, departments Hamlin offers. And so the curriculum for this particular seminar was designed on the one hand to deepen the students' awareness of how and why traditions tend to evolve in this way, away from the actual lived context in which it was born, and at the same time develop some transferable academic skills. The title of the seminar seemed to promise that we were on our way to recovering some lived, concrete facts about first-century Jewish life in the Galilee and Judea. But that dimension of the course was going to be continually juxtaposed to the counter-question, and what are we learning from this search for concrete realities? What are we learning about the realities of lived time and space that now we see are eluding us, that are beyond our grasp? And in order to do this, we constructed the course content around the universal human event, shared meals, eating together with others. The table, the title of the seminar, the table at the center of a meal would stand at the center of the curriculum as well. In any number of ways, concretely and metaphorically, as you'll see, this was indeed a course built around tables. It would provide a kind of conceptual and experiential hub from which all of the class activities and readings, discussions, would set out and then return. And this is how the seminar began. On the first day of class, I showed my students this book. Perhaps I've told you about the book before. If not, I want to explain why I began the seminar this way, and if I have, if you've heard the story already, I beg your patience. This was a my oldest and dearest friend, brought back to me after spending a year in Jerusalem nearly 50 years ago. And as I later paged through this prayer book, I realized that before leaving Jerusalem, my friend Richard had picked some wildflowers, and he'd pressed them between the pages. Well, when I first came across those flowers, they were still a bit lush. They still had those vivid colors, purples, greens, distinct shapes. They were still resilient to the pressure of the pages. But as I showed the book to my students last fall, and as I show it to you now, I can tell you that very few of those flowers remain. And those that do are dim and flattened. And here and there in the book, there's only a stain now, where there used to be a living flower. And I told my students, that's the way it's going to be with our seminar. The students were going to explore a world that had been as vital, vivid, as real and tangible and palpable as their own here and now. That world didn't simply live in artifacts and books. It was lived by people who interacted with those concrete realities just as they, my students, interacted with the world around them. And to do this kind of exploration of such a world from such a distance, culturally, linguistically, historically, what we were going to do was going to be something like trying to reconstruct the Jerusalem that my friend left behind just 45 years ago, using flowers that were left in the book. What can you learn about another time and another place from such things, from a flower, from a table, from a meal plucked from its world? How can that kind of dearth of data, drawn from such great historical and cultural distances, nevertheless illuminate in some way something real about another time and place? And then what kinds of academic and analytical skills would be most helpful in that regard? And finally, how might the insights gained in the process transfer to other subjects that they would be studying in the years ahead? We began that way, and then I said, but I want to point out one more thing. That if our intention were to elucidate the details of a single life from that distance, the kind of evidence we have to work with is of even less help, as data's validity depends largely on patterns and probabilities. But the kind of evidence we were going to be using can be illuminating if our objective is more general. That is to say, if what we're after is casting some light on the broader environment in which that particular life was lived. And that broader objective would be the goal of the seminar. This wasn't going to be a seminar on the historical Jesus, but on the historical environment in which the historical Jesus lived. And then I said, when they came back at the end of the term and closed their books for the last time, maybe they think once again of the flowers in my book, and be reminded once again of the difficulties involved in gauging the complex contours of a very different time and place. That was our first class session. Following that opening class session, as is the practice at Hamlin, first-year students all participate in a morning of service learning. And for their service, the students in my seminar visited an urban farming initiative in St. Paul, in a neighborhood adjacent to the campus. And they met with two organizers of the project. There were many possibilities for where first-year students would go for their morning of service learning, and this was, I thought, the best choice. The site was chosen to reinforce the seminar's theme of shared food. First of all, we'd be talking a lot about food in the coming weeks. But beyond more obvious connections, the particular neighborhood, Frogtown neighborhood, which was the neighborhood where this farming initiative is taking place, also provided the opportunity for initial conversations about socioeconomic class, about ethnicity, about community, about land ownership and stewardship, all in the space between the production of food and its consumption. And that would be a preoccupation of our seminar throughout the fall as well, those related themes. And the visit did indeed spark many such conversations that morning. But in addition, there was an unplanned opportunity for reflection, which came when the farm project's director began the visit, unknown to me beforehand, at her kitchen table. We started going to one of the sites. She had us into her home, put all 25 or so of us, me, the other folks helping with the seminar, around her table. It was, at one and the same time, a very fortuitous coincidence. And you might say it was a telling introduction to the theme of what a table might be. So if the morning of service learning might have seemed to have narrowed the distance between first century Galilee, 21st century Minnesota, subsequent class sessions would begin with a very concrete physical reminder of those challenges involved in exploring a topic that at one and the same time kind of intimated human proximity. We all eat. We all tend to eat in the presence of others. That kind of human proximity to the theme and historical distance. And this very physical reminder was that the very first day of class, when I came into the classroom that was assigned to me, I saw that there were tables and chairs scattered around the room. Little tables. Little tables that I pushed together to make one table that we could all share. I was intent on doing what I could in the seminar to avoid the impression that what this was going to be about was some kind of facile, anachronistic, obfuscating reenactment of first century. That's not what we were going to do. That act, that day, pushing those tables together, proved a helpful reminder at the beginning of every subsequent session, because within a few sessions, without my ever telling anyone to do it, the students themselves had assumed responsibility for pushing those scattered tables and chairs together. And now the table that they made at the beginning of each class and shared would serve as a reference point for the tables they were studying, and assembled anew at the start of each session. Couldn't assume that it would be there when they came in. That seminar table, along with the other tables in their lives, would signify the repeatedly posed question, which of the characteristics seemingly shared by the table you and I make each time we come together, and sit around, and the tables you know, in your homes, in your communities, which of the characteristics that are seemingly shared by those tables, purposes for which we're gathering together to study tables in a very different time and place, which of those characteristics will prove, in fact, analogous, and which only superficially so. Also, during that first week of class, each student in the seminar received a small bowl like this. The bowl was for them to keep, but I asked that they bring them to each class session. This bowl, acacia wood, is strikingly similar to a bowl recovered from the Bar-Kokhba cave excavation near the Dead Sea in 1960 by Yigael Yadin. Photographs of that bowl make it clear it's something very much like the bowl that I bought, 20 of them, at area Target. It was used by first century Jews. I gave each student a bowl to keep, but I said, bring it to class, every time. And in the weeks that followed, various objects were placed in or alongside the bowls. Bowls were chosen along with the objects to provide yet another material connection to the subject matter, and thereby spark discussion, but the bowl isn't empty. So one day, relatively early on in the term, I asked the students to put their bowls on the table, and I put this in. And if you pass that around, the objects that would be placed in their bowl over the coming weeks included a fig, some wine, a slip of paper bearing the Greek word polites, citizen. This that you have in the bowl being passed around now, something I may put in my bowl next week when I return. Sometimes the object was identified. I told the students what they were looking at. On other occasions, they were asked to find out what it was, and then come back and tell the class how they found out, where they went for their information, how they went about identifying it. In some lessons, for example, the bowls themselves would figure prominently. Let me just give you one example. The act of dipping in a shared bowl in Matthew 26, 20 through 23. That act of dipping, when discussed in class, provided us an opportunity to explore any number of what might seem kind of tangential, actually essential relationships that first century Jews might have with the people around the table and the bowls on the table. Inasmuch as to dip in the same bowl with someone else at a meal meant that you trusted the person. Because if it had a liquid in the bowl, the liquid conveyed impurity. And if you were a Pharisee, you kept yourself to the standard, you aspired to the standard of priestly purity even at daily meals. To share a bowl and dip with another was to say, I implicitly trust you. You recall who it was that Jesus said, I'm going to dip in the same bowl with this man at our table. That would have been, yes. So sometimes the bowl itself, in many moments during the course of the term, was the object of interest sometimes something in or by it. Finally, along with receiving their bowls, the students were introduced to reclining, which is the term that's consistently used in New Testament texts and in many rabbinic texts to describe any kind of formal dining. So, somebody remind us what reclining means. What was that about? How did you do it? How did you recline at a table? Yes. In which direction?
Not remembering.
Reclining didn't mean to lean back. It meant to eat Greek style, on your side. You reclined to the left because your left hand was useless for eating since you had used it all day for every other daily purpose. Every that left one hand free. I introduced the concept of reclining, first of all, as a matter of accuracy. Second, as a kind of bookmark that we would come back to through the course of the term to explore the degree to which the world that Jesus lived in, the Jewish world he lived in, was significantly touched by Hellenistic inclinations. That there were all sorts of indications in Jesus' world, even a fellow living in the Galilee, of the power of Hellenism. Reclining would give us one way of thinking through how intimate that influence would ultimately be. But in addition, reclining itself, from the first day forward, would prove a reminder of social stratification. Social stratification inasmuch as people who recline at a meal can no longer
Serve.
Right, exactly. They can no longer serve themselves. If you're reclining at a meal, it makes it much, much more likely that someone will be there to serve you. So, for example, the dispute described in Luke 22, 24, 27, concerning relative standing among Jesus' companions, as well as Jesus' response, should be framed in this context. What am I referring to? Who remembers the argument that breaks out, according to Luke, at that last dinner together?
The brothers want to be, one at his left and one at his right.
Yes, on one occasion it's posed that way. In this case, they just say, tell us the hierarchy. Where do we stand in the pecking order? And they were arguing about that hierarchy. Exactly. Exactly, Dwight. And what does Jesus say? I come to you as a diakonos, which means
Servants.
the waiter. At a table, it meant the person who waited on the others. Watch what I do. Literally. We're reclining. It's Passover. We're reclining as an indication of our liberation. Somebody's got to serve the others. And it's me. You draw your own conclusions. Understanding the social implications of the action alone would prove important to the seminar. Let me stop before I give you some more details about the curriculum and ask if there are any questions thus far. Questions or observations? I ask you what's in the bowl.
It looks like spelt.
It does, it does. It's a somewhat more common grain, but it's unhulled. It is barley, but it's unhulled barley. It hasn't been pearled or polished. One day, that was what ended up in the students' bowls. In a moment, when I ask you to look at the sheet that's been distributed to you, I'll suggest what one can learn from a little bit of unhulled barley placed on the table about Jesus' world. But for now, the general nature of the curriculum was this. The seminar curriculum was constructed then around 10 passages from the Synoptic Gospels in which Jesus is described as being hungry, or sharing a meal, or being present while others ate. And that's what you have on your sheet. Those are the passages. The course would make its way through those passages, extrapolating out from these various tables, as it were, into the surrounding environment. For pedagogical reasons, when a particular action or exchange was recounted in both a meal and a non-meal setting, and that's exactly what Dwight was noting, that in Luke it actually comes up twice. Who comes first in your accounting, Jesus? We chose, for the sake of continuity in the curriculum, the example set at a table. As each text was introduced and revisited, the students would be challenged to employ the sources they were using, primary and secondary, to enlarge upon the passage's whos and whens and whats and wheres and whys. Each text was associated with one or more topic in the larger curriculum, and most were linked to an object placed in or by the bowls. And in referencing these passages, the focus wouldn't be on what the text had been intended to convey. This wasn't a course on New Testament exegesis, but on things noted or suggested along the way. Necessary elements of the concrete reality, but often seemingly mute things, or in the textual background. The stuff on the table. Or to use the distinction drawn by Marcus Borg, we're going to look to the background, I told my students, in search of the context. And that's what you have on this sheet. So, as you can see, the texts are in the left-hand column. The topics that we covered in relation to those texts down the middle, and the objects placed by or near the bowls on the right. And as you see, in connection with Mark 12 through 14, we talked about barley grains. Now, before I ask you what that passage is, note that in connection with a few barley grains in their bowls, I managed to suggest to them that we could learn something about first century Jewish movements and affiliations, distinctive characteristics of Pharisaic fellowships and their role in shaping Jewish life, calendar and halakha, holidays from Passover to Pentecost. How do you get from a few grains of barley in the bowl to those topics? So, what's the passage, first of all? It's one version of it's the Sabbath. Jesus and his disciples are walking along. His disciples pick grains and rub off the husks and eat them. It's noticed by Pharisees, and they take Jesus to task, not for what he said to have done, but for what they imply he tolerates his students doing. And let me point out, although it wasn't central to our study, more often than not, the criticism is leveled at what Jesus apparently allows his students or his disciples to do, as it is anything he's said to have done himself, as in this case. Now, what can you learn learn from that passage about the things that I've listed as associated curriculum topics? First of all, let me suggest, what do you learn from a bunch of guys who are walking past a field and apparently find it in their interest to pick some raw barley grains, rub off the husk, and eat them? What does that already suggest to you? Yeah, pretty hungry. I looked all over for information about eating raw barley. Here's what I learned. Don't do that. Especially barley. Especially barley is suggested.
Why barley?
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's so terribly difficult to digest in raw form. Yeah, it's especially tough to digest. That's what the sources I looked at suggested. So just that alone indicates something of context. I would only add in this regard, there's never any question of theft, right? Nobody says, does anyone know why?
Weren't people allowed to take from the edges
Yes,
of the
thank you,
field?
Susan. Specifically in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy specifically says, if you're walking past your neighbor's field and you're hungry, help yourself, just don't, do you remember?
Take a lot with you.
Yeah, don't fill your
Fill your
pockets.
pockets.
That's right. That was the premise. So that's not the issue. The issue is it's the self. From that point, the other curricular connections follow. For example, what do you learn about calendar from this moment, directly and indirectly?
Harvest.
It was. Oh, very good. So let me put the more direct connection out so we can get past it, and that is, you learn something about the Sabbath cycle, right? You learn something about the weekly cycle, and we talked a great deal about the significance of the Sabbath cycle in Pharisaic doctrine. We did. But the more interesting point, the mute point, as it were, is this must have taken place at a season when the grains were big enough to pick and eat, which would have been when? Can you date it? Well, you can. The text doesn't say barley, it just says a cereal grain. If it was wheat, the winter wheat crop is ripe in Israel about the time of
Passover.
Yes, about the time of Passover. And one of the major themes of Passover, the unleavened bread matzah theme of Passover, is, in a practical way, all bound up with the fact that it's to be baked from new grain. It's new grain, so it can't possibly have leaven. We're talking about ambient leavening, right? Leavening that comes from leaving the grain out, leaving it out and letting it get wet, then baking. One of the underlying themes of the matzah, unleavened bread aspect of Passover is we've just harvested the grain, thank God. But the early grain tends to be wheat. Barley tends to take more time. Traditionally, about 7 more weeks. Which brings you to Pentecost, right? It's the 7 weeks between Passover and Pentecost, the 50 days. Jewish farmers in Jesus' world knew that those 50 days between Passover and Pentecost spanned the grain harvest. This text, without focusing attention on the issue, nevertheless has a context, a lived context, a season, a time when this was real. And we talked about that together in class. The 7 weeks of the spring grain harvest, from wheat to barley, from Passover to Pentecost. There were other other aspects of the curriculum that touched on the grain, but it gives you an idea of the model that we followed through the term. Olive oil proved equally fertile as a point of departure in numerous directions having to do with the world in which Jesus lived. Unleavened bread, once again. Wine, once again. Let me just say, why did I put figs? What is Matthew 12, 1 through 8?
I think they're reversed. Matthew 12 is Matthew 12 is the grain fields and Mark is
Yeah, so there are numerous references to figs in the Gospels. But this passage, you find it for you in Matthew. Oops, that's the green one, you're right. They've been switched here. The fig text
the Mark.
is the,
The Mark 11.
yes, Mark 11, thank you. They've been switched. The fig text, Mark 11, 12 through 14. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Now, I included this big reference, although there could have been many, for a very particular purpose. First of all, it pertains to Jesus alone. It's not a discussion, it's not a dispute, it's not a criticism. I chose it for another reason. Why did I choose to include it? Why do you suspect it's there? Yes, please.
I think it's Messiah has come, and you would expect the fruit trees to be giving fruit, and this fig tree says no.
And the fig tree says no, yes. And why is this such an extraordinary passage? What's so extraordinary about the fact that this survived in Mark? Why would you not have been surprised not to know it happened?
Well, it's nasty.
Well, yeah, here's what I'd say. Here's how I characterize it. I chose it instead because of its very frank, vivid, and concrete portrayal of an eminently human and hungry Galilean who was apparently unaware that figs were out of season. It's a remarkable passage, isn't it? It's extraordinary. And that the gospel preserves it, more extraordinary yet. I included it for my students not because it connected effectively with many other aspects of the curriculum, but because it's so real in really intriguing ways. He looks, he sees, he goes, he's disappointed, he doesn't understand what the narrator does. Isn't that amazing? He had the season wrong, but the narrator says, I know it wasn't in season, and he's angry.
Earl, did you get any pushback from the kids with that kind of picture of Jesus?
Well-
Jesus?
Well, we're a little ahead with the question, Mike, but here's what I said. No, it's
I
good.
like to show.
It's good. Next week, tell you how you might evaluate progress in a course like this. Yeah, what I used as my assessment of progress in the seminar, and the degree to which the kind of pushback that you're suggesting proved an indication of how much success we had made in the curriculum. We'll be back soon. Please.
I can't imagine that Jesus as a Galilean doesn't know the season. I find it impossible.
Isn't that amazing? Yes. All the more amazing. Yep.
I'm not sure that. I think that when Jesus comes, when the Messiah comes,
Yes.
that cycles are broken.
Yeah.
That traditions are set on their heads.
Yeah.
And he's going, there ought to be a big sin.
Well, here's what I would say, only in terms, and as I suggested at the beginning of our conversation, the purpose of the curriculum was not so much to tell us about any particular individual, but the environment in which they lived. What it does suggest is possibly this. There's a very, very interesting range of opinion among scholars regarding the degree to which Jesus was, in fact, a country man. Marcus Borg, for example, emphasizes Jesus' affinity for the rural side of Galilean life. There are others who disagree, who suggest that there's any number of indications that Jesus tended to relate better to town life, that his roots were in towns. Now, once again, without driving home the question in terms of the historical Jesus, what is perhaps illustrated here is the degree to which that might be true of any given first century Galilee. That just as you and I, to the extent that we're fully urbanized, might not be aware of certain features of rural life, that if we lived in the countryside, we would obviously know something worth learning from a distance. Oh, let me give you a personal example. When I was doing my student teaching as an elementary school teacher, my master teacher was Karen Mooney. Karen Mooney taught at North Heights Elementary School in Roseville, and on the side, Karen and her husband raised sheep. And until Karen was my master teacher, I had no idea when sheep lambed. I didn't know that they tend to be incompetent birthers, that they require a great deal of attention, but it's probably no accident that they lamb under the sign of Aries. Yeah. That if your sheep are lambing on the ground, it's not surprising you might see something corresponding to that in the sky, that calving tends to come later. I had no idea. It seems so integral to the lives of people that just live 40 or 50 miles away from it. And with all of the opportunities I might have to be familiar with it, I didn't know until I met Karen. There are those scholars who suggest that a homogenized impression of what it meant to be a Galilean in the first century shouldn't go as far as to suggest that living in towns didn't make a difference. And that someone whose life was oriented towards what was going in town, might that not be attuned, not so closely aligned with certain cycles in the surrounding countries. Maybe. If not this particular person, any given person. That's how we used it. I give you these texts, then, as a suggestion of how rich this conversation might be, extending from very concrete objects on very real tables, then and now. Additional topics included consequential social and political developments in early and middle Second Temple life, development of the Jewish diaspora, Jews living outside the land of Israel, first century sources on children and childhood. Instead of assuming, for example, that the references in the Gospels to Jesus' attitude towards children means something that we recognize inherently today, I had my students think through some material drawn from the period that sheds an interesting light on common attitudes towards children in Jesus' world, which maybe don't coincide directly or clearly with common attitudes about children today. Anyone, for example, anybody have any idea what that might be, for example? There's a rabbinic text. What if I told you this? There's a well-known rabbinic text that says, a person's good intentions are 13 years younger than a person's evil intentions. I'll use the text's actual terms. A person's good intentions are 13 years younger than a person's good intentions. Good intentions are 13 years younger than a person's evil intentions. What are they talking about?
Puberty?
I'm one of those people who says, I like my children best when they turn 18.
Yes, yes, yes. What does the rabbinic passage say? If we're talking about goodness, it requires a certain degree of understanding, and 13 years old means age of majority and personal responsibility for one's actions, right? That's what 13 years old signified. This text says children might be darling, they might be cute, you might love them, you might adore their innocence, but their innocence is wrapped up in a core of egoism, self-absorption. Now, if you and I understand that innocence in a way more commonly assumed to be the case today, we might possibly misunderstand, if not what Jesus intends when he says, you've got to be like little children, perhaps what people in the crowd heard. Who he was challenging, what they might have made of such a challenge. Okay, good, wonderful comments, questions. Let me just make one more observation about the curriculum, and we'll close for today. Next week, I'll put something else in the bowl. Go through a series of lessons together, about a week of the seminar, and see what a table might in fact tell us about Jesus' world. This last point is this. Along with the curricular elements that I've described for you, these topics, these objectives, the dean's office at Hamlin assigned all first-year seminar instructors one more task. They said, we need our students to develop discussion skills from the very beginning. The capacity to participate productively and educationally in discussion. And that each seminar should find a way to appropriately introduce that additional theme into their curriculum. In the case of our seminar, far from this being an encumbrance or an addition to what we were doing, it perfectly meshed with course content. As most of the 10 core texts that you have on your sheet Most of them include a discussion or a dispute. In most cases, they describe people sitting down to a table and an argument of some sort, eventually breaking out. The tone of the passages range from discussion to row, while the subjects stretch from the Sabbath to dietary rabbinic norms to personal status and social hierarchies, a little bit of everything in between. But equally significant in terms of developing students' discussion skills are the range of rhetorical strategies the texts attribute to Jesus. Once the dean's office said, we want you to use this theme of developing discussion skills in a way that's appropriate to your curriculum, and I looked at what I had already intended to use, I realized one of the more interesting aspects of these range of disputes and arguments captured in these texts is that Jesus is described as employing a wide range of rhetorical responses, apparently based on his capacity to read context in which the dispute breaks out, particular nature of the argument, and the people involved. The strategies include analogies to Pharisaic norms. At a table hosted by a Pharisee, Jesus raises a halachic argument in response to an implied criticism. You have to know the precedent that he's citing in order to appreciate that he's citing a rabbinic precedent that the other people at the table already are aware of. But instead of just laying into them, which he does in other cases, castigation, uses a text that was already assumed to validate the behavior he was about to do. Tell me, not by my standards if I'm wrong, explain to me by our shared standards why I'm wrong. Or biblical precedents, or appeals to self-respect expected of any Jew. The story in Luke about who's number one around here, do you remember how that ends? It happens in Matthew quite a bit too. But in Luke, Jesus says, look, I'm setting the model here. You're all reclining. I'm serving you. If you want it the other way, keep in mind, think of how this all meshes together so perfectly. Kind of people that go after those kinds of honors?
It's the Goyim.
Yes, they're not Jews. There's something inherently un-Jewish about aspiring to a high place in the hierarchy. That's the argument made. It's carefully chosen for that particular context. Exactly. An appeal to Jewish self-respect. Or, of course, illustrative parables and metaphors. Or symbolic actions. I tell you what. Watch who I did with. And tell me what you make of it. Or, equally intriguing, one of the test questions for the final test has to do with the passage in which Jesus is confronted with paying taxes to Caesar. That's a really, really interesting passage. There are all sorts of ways in which features of the passage are right on the surface. But I asked my students to consider, remember this is whose picture is on the denarius, right? And the famous response, so give to Caesar what's Caesar's, but give to God what's God's. What does Jesus say? Show me your denarius. Why doesn't he pull one out of his own pocket
He doesn't have any.
Yeah. What does the very fact of saying, oh, that's interesting, you're carrying one. What does that mean?
You have an idol in your pocket.
Yes, yes. What a different passage it would be if it said Jesus reached into his pocket and pulled out a denarius. Those kinds of rhetorical strategies suggest, as I believe, a kind of pedagogical sophistication that helps us to appreciate why Jesus made such a tremendous impression as a disputant. I think that's a very well-seated memory. And it has to do with the fact that he had a full box of tools. This wasn't a man who thought everything was a nail because all he had was a hammer. This is a man who looks around the table, gauges the question, thinks through the context, and can answer in any number of skillful ways. So, that too becomes part of the curriculum, and when at the end of the term the dean said, so how did you do the discussion part of the curriculum? I said, well, I let Jesus do the job. Next week. It's a Methodist school. Next week, I'd like to go through about a week of the curriculum and see how what we've talked about today pans out in practice and then make some final observations. Thanks very much.